Hello, everyone. My name's Phil Calvert, and a very warm welcome to the Financial Advisor Mastermind and Challenge. Throughout this week, advisors, leading experts, and consultants to the financial planning profession are sharing amazing insights into just what makes a world-class financial advice business. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with someone who is well known throughout the financial advice world and described as someone who can make the mind-blowingly tedious somewhat bearable. Please welcome Managing Director of Zero Support, or Managing Partner, I think you are, Mr. Phil Young. Hi, Phil. How are you doing?
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well indeed, thanks. I think the last time we met was in a bar in South Africa.
It was.
Just before we were due to speak at a conference to 3,000 or 4,000 financial advisors out there. It was a great event, wasn't it?
I thought it was going to be kind of like maybe 100, I think it was 150 people or something like that for some reason I had in my head. And when I walked in there and it was like an aircraft hangar full of people.
It was.
You were up there at the time, so, and you looked like you know what you're doing in that situation. So I was kind of even more terrified at that point.
I have to say, it's one of those venues that you walk in and jaw drops and it takes your breath away, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really interesting. I'm fascinated. And it was great to see you there because I follow what's going on in the world of financial advice around the world. And, you know, we've always felt, it's always been said over here in the UK that perhaps the Australians have been a bit ahead of us over the years, or maybe the Americans. But the financial advice world in the UK really seems to be firing on all cylinders at the moment, doesn't it?
It does. And I mean, some of that comes out of the level of regulation that we get in the UK, which is, you know, it's ironic that there's people out there that say it's kind of admirable how much we've got on here. And if you ask most advisors, I think they might have a slightly different take on these things for it. But it's the rest of the world's eyes are on us to see what's going to happen next, how far we push things, what new sort of concepts and ideas we bring in, and what can happen. At the same time, we tend to, in my perception is, we tend to look to the US increasingly for technology nowadays and see what's happening over there. And sometimes, you know, I hear advisors will say that it's easier to do things and to be more innovative in the US because there is less regulation. I'm not sure whether that kind of works or not, whether that stacks up, but there's definitely that perception. There's an advisor a few years ago said to me something that always stuck in my head, where he said, I've kind of just accepted now that I run a franchise of the FCA. You know, they control a lot around the pricing, the way in which I can deliver my service to people. I've got a degree of flexibility, but it feels like a franchise. And I thought it was kind of a sad thing. I don't think it was meant as a compliment necessarily at the time. But I can see how at times that comes in. I think there's actually a lot more flexibility and freedom than people think and realise. But there's clearly, there's a regulation in the UK that's been interested in setting some clear parameters and doing certain things. At the same time, I think they're under an enormous amount of pressure right now with in particular with things like DB transfers and what's going on there. Yeah. The fingers are about to start being pointed seriously. I've been watching the debate around contingent charging just the last week or so. I mean, there's an article I need to write, and I was like, right, that's something that's of interest. Which I think a lot of that's a red herring. We're in a position where we're blaming kind of concepts like contingent. You know, a contingent charge has never advised anybody. I'm not entirely convinced that you would get much better advice all of a sudden by changing the charging model. I can see advantages and disadvantages to it. But MPs getting involved as well. You know, MPs have been at the forefront of pensions freedoms and choice and things like that. The regulator will be nervous about getting the blame for this, and advisors are obviously going to get the blame for it. There are individuals where the finger's going to be pointed at. Blaming it on contingent charging feels like a way of avoiding that for the time being. But I think eventually a day of reckoning awaits on some of this stuff.
Yeah. When we look over to the United States, do you think there's anything that we really should be learning from them?
I think in the US and also in places like South Africa as well, I've always believed that necessity is the mother of invention. And some of the technologies that they've adopted, which are fairly basic, simple things, rather than big, bold, the ocean stuff that you expect to see come over here, are really just born out of necessity. So the geography, for example, in the US, it is a very, very big country. There are more advisors out there, but the geography is actually absolutely huge to cover. So just using things like Skype or Zoom, as we're doing right now, that there seems to be quite a prolific take-up of these sorts of technology out there, which when you're in the UK, in my experience, most advisors tend to look after a client bank that are predominantly, not all of them, but predominantly within about a 40-minute drive away. If you live in London, you're perhaps a bit less addicted to your car as you are do in other parts of the country, but most people are driving around rather than getting a train or public transport to go and see clients. Increasingly, people are coming into advisors' offices anyway to do stuff, but I do think, particularly if you're looking after clients that are already working and aren't retired and time's precious for them, there's just a big adoption of simple technologies that I think advisors in the UK could pick up on. Things like DocuSign, which I've raved about for years. We in my days at 360, we picked up on that, and just not making people use pens and stupid things like that anymore. I'm really pleased. I've got a meeting later on this afternoon with someone from Origo. They're interested now as well as sort of getting rid of biros and adopting paperless signature right throughout the whole of the industry. We worked out within one of my roles at Sense at the network there. We think now that, with the exception of possibly one piece of paper, which is between us and some of the business owners, which needs to be signed as a deed, there is absolutely nothing that the network requires, whether it's between us and the ARs and the advisors, or between the advisors and the clients, that actually needs a wet signature anymore. But most platforms and product providers and fund managers aren't that progressed with that thinking right now. And there may well be good reasons in some areas for that, but I'm keen to really push on that side of things. So I think the things that I actually think are better progressed in places like the US are born out of just it's small ticket things that are available here right now, not a kind of all-encompassing massive new back office system that will make your client a cup of tea and all the rest of it. So I think there's lots of incremental gains that we can make out of it.
Yeah. We might explore that a bit more. I read some statistic the other day. Apparently in the United States, every day there are 20,000 financial advice seminars. Face-to-face stuff. So we're using all the technology and being able to meet clients like that. But apparently, there's still quite a thirst for consumers to see the whites of the eyes of the financial advisor. And but 20,000 a day, that kind of, well, it's a big place, obviously, and there's a lot more advisors over there. But seminars has always been one of my hobby horses over here. That we just don't see enough advisors getting on their feet in front of people. I think we can get hooked a little bit too much on the technology of communication. When in actual fact, and I was talking to somebody earlier about this morning, trust, the ability to meet someone, get a sense of who they are. The internet is great up to a point, but we just aren't doing enough of that stuff in my opinion.
I totally agree. I think as I said, that there are a lot of face-to-face meetings which are a slog where it's advisors turning up with bits of paper that I do think can be done a lot more efficiently. Sitting down with somebody and going through the paperwork side of things. When in a lot of cases, it's just I will just sign whatever you put in front of me at that point in time. Those are the sorts of things that can get rid of. But in terms of ways of getting in front of people and getting in front of the clients and stuff like that, then what's strange in a way is we actually know what works. You can look at your own metrics, you can look at the figures and see that things like seminars and stuff like that just generally tends to generate a level of interest. But it requires a couple of things, and this is kind of something that I just see in businesses across the board. The ones that win and the ones that are successful aren't necessarily the ones that are being highly innovative. It just comes down to discipline and a bit of stamina and organising events. Just marketing full stop actually requires some machinery and consistency and persistency around it, just to keep hitting people with messages rather than spend some money on a one-off campaign and expect the money to come and the clients to come rolling in, which
Yeah,
we
yeah.
know it doesn't happen. I don't think there's a marketeer really in the world that would actually tell you that it is going to happen that way.
Yeah, yeah. We better just put in context who you are, because there'll be one or two youngsters who don't
Good
actually
Lord,
know,
no.
don't know who Phil Young is. And I thought, well, how do we best describe Phil Young? And I thought the best thing to do would be take a couple of things off your LinkedIn profile. Now, first of all, so Bankhall will probably be the first place that people know you from. Some while ago, I think.
Yeah,
now.
it was a good while ago. Yeah.
And then you were MD of 360. Did you actually set up 360 in the first place?
It wasn't just me. It was a bunch of us who were kind of the blue collar workers, if you like, at Bankhall at the time, and we kind of left and felt at the time that we could set something up and do something in a slightly different way from the way that those guys had done it. So it wasn't just me on my own setting it up, but there was a bunch of shareholders involved in it. By accident, we ended up creating our own succession plan because we were all of different ages, different skill sets, and stuff like that. So when we eventually sold 360, which was back in 2010 now. I was myself and Russell, who's still there now, Laura Chuck, who's still there now. There were a number of people who were smaller shareholders and were at the younger sort of age bracket that stayed on. Some people wanted to retire, some people wanted to do other things, so it all worked out pretty well.
Yeah. So you've been described as, one guy says, I've known Phil for some time in a business capacity, both through my time at Bankhall. He's a highly gifted financial services professional with the unusual ability to fit comfortably across the wider financial services spectrum with a deep knowledge of technology, product strategy and delivery. And another chap said, from our discussions about how wraps and platforms would evolve, that's an interesting one, Phil's continued to be at the forefront of the curve and always well worth talking with. Unfortunately, his taste in football is on a par with mine. So tell us what it is you do now and how you help advisors.
So I guess what I do now is use the experience that I've built up over the years, both almost acting a little bit of the kind of pooling the collective knowledge of what's going on amongst advisory firms. I've done that throughout my whole career. People have always picked up the phone to me, rung me on and said, what's going on? And effectively what they want to know is, what are people doing that's working and what are people doing that isn't working that I should just avoid, and just avoid the kind of distraction with it all. And we all know that there's a million shiny new things that are out there at any point in time. It's very easy to get distracted as an advisor and kind of and off down a particular rabbit hole that's not really going to benefit your business. So there's an element of that, just bringing that kind of experience. There's also an element of bringing my experience of being in a startup business, as it was at the time, growing that business and building it up and starting to formalize it, selling it to a big corporate entity and dealing with them. I was still there for 7 years afterwards, sold it, running the business. And how all that feels along the way. So a lot of so there's quite a lot of chats that I have with people who are in particular wanting advice on how to take the business from what's been effectively a fairly informal lifestyle business over the years, and how to grow that and evolve it and formalize it a little bit more, potentially around an exit strategy. I mean, but it doesn't necessarily need to be around an actual sale. But from my point of view, unless we have kind of a 5-year plan, is what I generally build with most businesses. Unless you have a sense of trajectory and a sense of motion in the business and a destination to aim towards, and growing the capital value or the income level or whatever gives you all of those sorts of things. Without that, you tend to bumble along. So a lot of people pick up the phone to me and want to chat when they're kind of, not necessarily as just new startups, but when they've been in the business for 5, 6, 7 years and they're kind of saying, it's okay, but I don't really know where I take this now. I don't really know where we kick on from here and where we get to. So that's something that I've had experience myself on. There's other people that I'll talk to around the sharp end of things when they come into sale as well. And you can get a huge amount of advice out there from lawyers, accountants, etc. I've got some of that knowledge, not quite the same level of depth as just some of the real experts out there. But I understand the mechanics of it. I think what's important and what people want to speak to me about, though, is the emotional side of things. When you come to sell your own business, you do go on a bit of an emotional roller coaster ride, and there is throughout the whole process there is actually a real shift in the power dynamics between the buyer and the seller. So you'll be courted by people quite heavily in the buying. When you put yourself up for sale, if you like, a lot of people don't want to put themselves formally on the market and go to a tender process, even though that might actually generate a better price, if you like. But there's a discomfort around saying that you're going to sell, and that's interesting. That's worthy of exploration as to why in the first place, because some people don't really want to do it but feel as though they should do. When you sign the heads of terms, none of that's binding, so you don't have to agree to anything at the back end of that process, but it does provide a degree of exclusivity, so you can't talk to anybody else during that particular period in the heads of terms. If you've gone through a formal process and then you're back on the market at the end of it, then obviously it's a bit like putting your house up for sale and people saying that's been on the market for 12 months, there must be something wrong with it, or so there's kind of little things and little ebbs and flows along the way. And then when it gets to the crunch state, even post sale, that's when a lot of the problems start to come out. So my advice generally to people in that process is to basically be as honest with yourself first of all, and a lot of people aren't really that honest with themselves, and also with the buyer, or vice versa if you're buying another company, as to what's going to happen after the money's exchanged hands and after the contract's been signed. I tend to find that where there's a lot of grey area, where they've kind of fudged over these things just to get a deal done, and that happens on both sides of the party, that's where everyone's got a different thought in the head as to what's going to happen, and there's usually there's a row that emerges at the back end of things. Somebody told me once, again, it's these kind of little nuggets that always stuck with me, with a lot of experience in this area, said the best deals are always either very friendly or very hostile, because in those circumstances, regardless, even with the hostile one, you know exactly what's going to happen on the other side of things. So there's no grey area. Everybody knows that they're going to lose the jobs or whatever it's going to be. But it's the grey area, really, which people think that they're doing the right thing just to be friendly, just to be nice, and just to get there. It's when people say what they think that the other party wants to hear, just to get a deal done on the other side of the fence, on the other side of the deal, that's where it tends to start to unravel.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could go down several rabbit holes and we could talk about the joys of MiFID II or GDPR. But
no
if people are... We won't go there now. But I know there's sort of areas that you sort of dig deep into and have helped advisors with. One of the things I see quite a lot in our forums is advisors talking about getting their business proposition right now. Yeah. We're in a fee world now. And I think a number of advisors are kind of waking up to the idea, well, actually, we've got to offer something that people will be prepared to pay a fee for. Or we might just go visit our friend Google instead. What are the sort of things that you see going on within financial advice firms, presumably at board level, and how they're handling this, perhaps with a view to building a better business for that eventual sale?
I think there's been an overemphasis perhaps on the initial sales part of things. In my experience, lots of advisors report back to me when I push them on it, and they'll take training in this area a lot. And I'm like, well, is this really where the problem is? They'll tell me that the conversion rates when they're sat in front of that new client are through the roof. It's kind of over 95%. You look at it and think you don't really need a lot of help at that point in time. Of course, at that point, the client's not really experienced any the actual service, so it's kind of taken on trust, it's taken on the belief that it's something you're going to need at that point. I think increasingly now where I'm seeing an emphasis on, and I think this is the right place to put the emphasis is on the ongoing service of the client, which hasn't really had the level of attention that it deserves. But my view, which is intentionally controversial, one to try and disturb people into action, I guess, to an extent, is that the majority of annual review meetings are account management meetings for the benefit of the advisor to make sure that the client's stays around, as opposed to anything of major value to the client. I know people will argue with that, and everyone does it slightly differently. But I think if you start with that in mind and think, is that actually really what I'm doing in these meetings? Am I just ticking some boxes and making sure that the client's still happy, and then I can go away and do very little for the next 12 months or so? We know most of the margin is in that part of it, and most people leak margin, leak cost in particular in the initial piece of advice, and in many cases will knowingly make a loss on it because there's more fat in it further down the line for clients. But I found, and I've looked at the analysis across the board in different industries, different parts of financial services as well, is that people tend to question the value of something where it's an ongoing relationship. After the tipping point seems to be about 5 years. It's kind of a 5-year itch where all of a sudden people forget what you did in the early days, which would potentially have been loss leading, or you wouldn't have made any real profit on it. After 5 years, you might, if you look at the lifetime value of that client, you might be making some money off them at that point in time. It might be balancing itself out. What people do tend to forget the amount of effort and how good it felt in the first couple of years, because it felt like you were really kind of moving things on an awful lot in your life. It becomes a bit tick over after 5 years, and you start to kind of question those things. So I think it definitely is worth thinking about how that pans out, and how you can start to change the type of value that you add over a period of time. And what those account management meetings, what those client meetings need to look like. There's a couple of sort of things in particular that people are looking at that I think are interesting at the moment. One is that there's people interested in looking after younger clients, which is more of a battle. So designing propositions around that. My advice to them is to try and calculate what the lifetime value of a client would be. If you look at providers, for example, offering junior ISAs, there's not that many of them that do it because the margins that you make are small. I actually think if you looked at the lifetime value of those clients, assuming that a fair number of them leave the money invested, which is what the research that I've seen so far suggests, then that paints a very different picture. And indeed, I think longer term, the values of advice businesses will start to become, it will reflect a younger client bank. That if you've got a client bank that are all aged 80, if you're going to buy that business, you've got to price in the fact that you're not going to hang back. But really, the value of the business is what am I buying? What's the value of it, and how long am I going to hold on to that for? We know that if you're buying 80-year-olds in particular, then you're not going to hold on to that money for that long. And we also know that there's loads of research, both in the US and the UK at the moment, to suggest that people will just sack, that a younger generation will sack the parents' advisor ongoing. It's the same with husbands and wives as well. If the advisor hasn't really been dealing with someone's wife or husband to that extent, they tend to get sacked up after that. One spouse has died that they tend to deal with.
I'd like to explore that a bit. I mean, it's always been an issue, this, about should we go for younger clients, or shall we just focus on the clients that we have now before we retire or sell the business? In fact, I'm meeting someone in a couple of days' time who specializes in helping professionals to start having conversations with the next generation down, who may become clients in 3 to 5 years' time. I mean, do we have to look that far out, do you think, to attract those younger clients?
I think you've got to pick your market, really. I'm a big fan of advisors being niche, particularly if there's smaller businesses, which 95% of advice businesses out there are small businesses.
Yeah.
If you're going to set yourself stall, I think at the moment the average advised client age is around 62. So it's in the mid 60s anyway. Yeah. It fundamentally, for all the kind of arguments about what name financial advisors should give themselves, whether it's planners or advisors and whatever, wealth managers, fundamentally I believe that the majority of advisors are retirement planners. And you could almost say that's what we actually do and specialise in. I think a lot of people would get a lot more business in through the door if they actually gave themselves that label, because that's really what we're focusing on. Dabbling at pitching to a younger generation, I think, will be successful if you're going to dabble at that and just do a little bits and pieces of it. You might attract a few more, you might retain it a little bit more along the way. So I do think it needs quite a lot of thought behind it. If you go, what doesn't work is offering out a service to younger clients, which is just a kind of poor man's version of the service that you're offered to your main client. You almost need to pull the whole thing apart and say, well, actually, if we're going to pitch to people that are young professionals in the 30s, they don't need advice about all the things that I'm dealing with from existing clients. They might need a different fee model. They might need debt advice. They might need a load of things that a lot of advisors haven't touched for years. Even things like mortgages, insurance, all these things.
Yeah.
A lot of guys out there have gone fully down the wealth route, dealing with people that are retiring or retired with established wealth. And don't need to touch a mortgage, and I kind of get why that's the case. In a lot of cases, they don't need to worry too much about insurances, and don't bother with it at all in many cases. So I think you need to kind of accept whether you're in that market or not. Really apply a good degree of thought to what you do around that.
I've seen a few firms starting to really get their heads around this, at least think about this now. And the common thread I'm seeing between them is they're focusing on young entrepreneurs. Yeah, they're in their 30s. These are people who are just brimming with ideas, coming out with quite often tech companies. And the advisors are seeing a role for them as not necessarily retirement planners, but more like fancy life coaches, to put it in a simplistic way. And perhaps so there's a role for life planners or lifestyle financial planners. They may find it easier to get into a younger market. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think you're right. I mean, the market isn't huge, so you've got to be really good in that market. So, I know a few guys that specialise in exactly that sort of thing. They'll deal with tech entrepreneurs, also creative media type. But it's really about developing a niche, because you want referral business. It's quite a specialised market. And there are specific individuals there as well with specific needs. It's difficult to be a generalist and say, I'm also in this particular niche in some cases. So I think you've got to take a view as to whether you're really going to commit to going down that market as well, whether you're successful in it or not. It's not something you can do in a kind of, a little bit on the side, half-hearted sort of way. And in particular, your website needs to reflect all of that, the way in which you approach things. You're not going to need to wear a suit again, which is good news if that's what suits you. But if you're turning up being, the traditional IFA, it's just not going to work. Where it works absolutely perfectly. And a lot of younger advisors that have kind of really bought into the whole niche idea and will be dealing with tech entrepreneurs or women who've been divorced, or these sorts of niche areas where there's very specific needs. There are a few things that worry me at times around it, because a lot of the guys, if you take tech entrepreneurs for example, a lot of them will maybe have several million that they've got to invest. Won't necessarily that they'll want to have a play pot of money. And I think there are dangers that if you don't decide what your proposition is and what the boundaries of that service that you're going to offer are, you can get drawn into advisors dealing with sports people are a classic example. It's often a disaster because they treat the advisors like they would do their agent or their own mother to an extent. Everything, want to get into all kinds of wacky investments and all sorts of stuff, and advisors sometimes don't have the confidence to say, no, this isn't me. I don't advise in these sorts of areas at all. I think again with certain types of clients, tech entrepreneurs, people with lots of money that are too young to be retiring and want to dabble and want to take, they almost want to be mini private equity investors in their own right, and maybe put some money into one of the mates firms that are setting up. Or those are all great ideas. You just got to understand where your own limits are as an advisor, because you're not somebody that can necessarily deal with those things. If your role is just to protect them from spending the money that they need to keep, and you're going to manage that, and then the rest of it they can deal with, and that's fine. Some of them seem to want a kind of personal, a genuine personal, almost non-exec for their lives, if you like. But you can call it a life coach or whatever. But it's
a non-exec for their lives. That's a
you're building a kind of it's people that have an advisory board of people. They might have a lawyer and accountant. It's almost like an informal family office, if you like. And it's people that we want to bring in and sort of pick the brains on. The fact that you've got a responsibility that you're actually a financial advisor just means that you've got to draw those boundaries fairly clearly as well. So again, even if you're in that market and it's working well, you should need to think long and hard about how, what it is that you do and what you don't do as much as anything else.
So how does this pan out for the future? I mean, we'd all like to think there's always going to be a place for high quality face-to-face advice. But if the demographic is clearly changing, and the demographic is getting younger, and we've got these people who won't necessarily, their first instinct will not necessarily to go to a financial advisor. How do you see the future for the whole financial advice profession, as we like to call it now?
There is a counter view to it. So I looked at the stats, and these come straight from government departments of statistics and all the rest of it. If you wind the clock on over the next 10 years, the part of the demographic that appeals to face-to-face advice right now, which is that the number one category is 60 to 70, and then the next one is 70 to 80. The third one down is sort of 50 to 60. Outside of that, there is very little at all, in terms of a younger age group. If you wind the UK demographic on 10 years, the market for 60 to 70, which is the most popular one, is actually going to increase by about 10%.
Right.
So if you extrapolate all the data out, which I've seen done, we think that there will be a 10% increase in people wanting advice, retirement advice, if you like, which predominantly I think we can assume is baby boomers, and it's more complex to retire than it ever has been. At the same time as it's easy to invest. So I do think over the course of the next 10 years or so, there is still this wall of baby boomer money that's hitting retirement that will just require traditional face-to-face advice. And you can just afford, you should be looking to tweak how that works, improve it, but there's no radical shift required, I don't think, for that. So if your job as an advisor is just to ride out in the next 5 years or so, and if you're approaching 10 years and you know that this is going to change dramatically, then you've got a problem for it. So if you're going to retire in 5 years as an advisor, as a lot of people will do, that you could make a good case to say, why would I bother changing? If you look beyond that 10-year period, and you go into a different profile of person. It's not. We talk as if all of a sudden, there's a year and everybody changes. But I do think at that point in time, people's expectations will change once we get to that point, and they will expect. But my own view, which is based on my own experience, is you almost want. You want your money on a kind of self-directed platform, and you want very expensive. And I almost don't care how much that costs, but an expensive help button that you hit that says, "Here's all my money. It's on a platform. It's invested in these areas. You tell me where to go in and what to do and how to structure it, and I'll pay you for advice along the way." I think the analogy that I make right now is that advisors at the moment feel a little bit like an old-fashioned shopkeeper. You used to go into a shop, you'd see a guy behind the counter with a long coat on, and all the stuff's in the background somewhere. So you have to move to their platform, whatever they've got, their investment proposition. You don't really go like as you do into a supermarket, wander around. You can see everything that's available at that point in time. So I think there will be an expectation further down the line for the advisor to ride alongside you in that journey and help you with what it is that you buy and what you do and all the rest of it, as opposed to being the guy that stood behind the counter, dealing with questions for 4 candles and all that.
Quite.
Stuff.
So with that in mind, does the profession, is it going to be appealing to younger advisors? This comes up time and time again. How do we get youngsters into the profession? Do they want to come in?
It's absolutely nuts at the moment, because if you sat down, I know plenty of lawyers, for example. I'm a sort of failed lawyer in my own right, and the vast majority of them say we would never advise anyone to get into law or to become a solicitor, because it's terrible in a real state at the moment. Accountancy, I think, is going to be heavily disrupted over the course of the next few years. The easy accountancy stuff is just going to get wiped out by stuff like Zero and things like that are already doing the kind of basic bookkeeping and filling the forms in. Now, if you're going to pay for an accountant, it's going to have to be some proper quality advice that you need for it. And most of those professions know it. And people in them will admit that. If you think about becoming a financial advisor, I can't think of any other profession where you can earn as much money for something as enjoyable that fits a really good lifestyle. It's very flexible. You can kind of work whatever hours you want. You can work really hard. You can work part-time fairly easily, I think, if you want to, as an advisor. You can really craft the role as how you want to. It involves having chats with people, getting involved with people, talking to them. So if you enjoy that sort of thing, then great. Yeah. And there's a way, because of the way in which it's structured, because of the value that's provided, you can make a lot of money doing it that way. Even the barriers to entry for setting up your own business, if you wanted to do that, are relatively low compared to most other professions out there. So it's a great career to get into. And one of my frustrations is there's been a lot of talk about how do we get clients engaged with financial planning. Most advisors I know have got a queue of people at the door. They don't need more clients. The main issue and the constraint is the amount of advisors that are around there almost at the moment. So if you went around most universities and actually got people in front of advisors and said, whatever's in your head at the moment is a thing of the past. It's, there isn't commission anymore. It's a genuine profession, or certainly a burgeoning profession that's coming through. There should be a queue at the door of people wanting to become a financial planner, and it just isn't at the moment. I think there's certainly people that I've spoken to that are looking to retrain from being a solicitor or an accountant and stuff like that, because they've actually seen the value of it and what a great career it can be. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done to get more people into the industry as actual planners and advisors, not necessarily just as clients.
Interesting.
Because otherwise it's just going to carry on being an expensive thing and relatively inaccessible for people to get hold of the right people.
So kind of starting to wrap up, if we're looking forward over the next 5 years or so and firms want to start upping their game a bit, what sort of things should they be focusing on within their businesses right now to really make themselves look attractive in the future?
But I guess most of the stuff that I tend to do comes really from the top down. So, I'm very big on the amount of management information that's available in the business. If you're running things on a bit of a kind of, it's all a bit sort of finger in the air, a bit ish. You need to have a plan in place. It doesn't need to be anything. It can be on one piece of paper, which is to say, we want a business that's worth this in X number of years, or we want a business that kicks out this amount of income in X number of years. Or it could be, we want to generate this amount of income because I, as a business owner, want to sit back and not effectively work in the business full time. So we need a plan that fits around that. But there needs to be a sense of direction or a sense of trajectory in there. You need to have at least, I would say, 3 years, ideally, accepting the fact that years 4 and 5 are a little bit made up, but a cash flow model that goes through that 5-year plan that says, advisors are increasingly used to do cash flow models for their own clients, and don't do it to put in their own business. If you haven't got that kind of modelling in place, then you won't know what you should be charging in the first place, or what's going on. You won't know how many people you need to recruit over that period of time. You won't know what adjustments you need to make now to cope with the fact that in 5 years' time, this is going to be, it might be less profitable based on your growth plan. So you can make the adjustments now, knowing that it's going to work in 5 years, and just keep tack on it. Exactly the same as the whole sales point that people make to clients about why they should use cash flow modeling. You're going to need to make changes and adjustments along the way, but you can start making those adjustments early enough on to have a big impact further down the line. And I tend to find that planning is not really there. And usually it's because everyone's bumbling along, and it seems to kind of work, but they're not quite sure why. Which is fine if you just want to carry on doing that. But if you really want to kind of grow with a sense of an end game or a sense of direction, which could just be succession within your firm or whatever, you need to have that kind of structure in place, and you need to have the MI in place as well to be able to tell you, if I pull this lever, then this is what happens. If I do this, then it's going to cause a lot of disruption. It's not really going to have a noticeable impact on the business that we've got.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of planning and there's a bit of hard work involved in getting that in place. The upside is that once you've got that plan done once, the business kind of almost takes care of itself. I've even in my latter days at 360, it just, we had things planned out to the nth degree, and it just became kind of quite dull as a business to run, because I knew how many people I needed to recruit, when I needed to recruit them, where to get them from. We had stuff planned generally well in advance like that, and there's always things that crop up out of the blue that take you off tack, but the fundamentals of the business are all there and planned out, so it makes life a lot easier.
That's really interesting. So going back to where we started, just looking around the world, if we look at mature markets, not so mature markets, and then we come back to our market here in the UK, are we missing any big tricks here in the UK, which maybe they've got a handle on elsewhere? Is there something our profession hasn't quite mastered yet here?
I don't think there's anything. I think even the technology in America, I've talked to advisors out there, and some say it's absolutely rubbish, the technology out here as well. So it's the same all year. I think there are some incremental gains that people have got that they don't implement, things like using Zoom as we're doing right now with clients, or using DocuSign, because they're waiting for something bigger to go. They're waiting for somebody else to solve the problem for them almost. I think the regulator has driven the agenda quite a lot, and we've become a bit complacent and kind of waiting to be told what to do to move on to the next step and what happens next with it all. So there is a little bit of a cultural thing in the UK where we're actually looking to platform or the FCA or someone to kind of drive the change that goes forward in our business. I think in other countries where they haven't had that big shock, they've learned how to drive the business forward themselves a little bit more. Some of the people out there are a bit more self-motivated to do things, to make those sorts of changes in their business. But the fundamentals of running a business are the same. It's basically, make sure that you've got a plan, figure out what things are going to stop you from hitting those objectives, and make sure that you've got the financial model in place, and you can adjust and tweak and change as you want to for it. But without that sense of it's that agency that sits in your business to say, we're going to actually push things forward. And I think that's kind of sometimes the thing that's a little bit missing in the UK.
Yeah. Interesting. That's been absolutely fantastic, Phil. Thank you. We're asking each of the people that I'm interviewing to kind of come up with a little mini challenge that they might be able to set for our financial advisor viewers. If you're going to set a challenge for them, I don't know, over the next week, month, years, 10 years, whatever, what would you challenge people to be doing?
I think harking back again to the question around recruiting more planners into the profession, full stop. But the number one, outside of regulatory issues and stuff that pops up from time to time, the number one complaint that I get from advisors is that they struggle to recruit people.
Right.
The challenge that I tend to throw back is if you recruited a brand new advisor, let's say a graduate or whatever, somebody fresh into the profession tomorrow, what would their first 100 days look like? Could you articulate a career plan for 2 years? There's one firm that I talk to that have absolutely no problems recruiting the brightest and the best from their local university, but they give everybody that joins a 5-year career plan.
Right.
But the challenge that I would set forward is to say, what does the career plan look like? If you're trying to recruit anybody into your business, what does that plan look like for them? And how compelling, if you were honest with yourself, if you looked at that as your own career plan, how compelling is it for them?
Phil, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. So if advisors need your help or want to engage you in any way, how can you and Zero Support help advisors?
I've got a website, which is zerosupport.co.uk, which generally gets most of the messages are spammers sending through from it. So if I accidentally delete it, then I apologise. Or you can get me on phil.young@zerosupport.co.uk, which is probably the best one.
Fantastic. Phil, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate your help and your time. Absolutely superb. Look forward to seeing you in another bar in South Africa on another occasion.
Yeah.
And for everyone watching today, thanks again for your time. I hope you found this useful, this conversation with Phil Young, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.